Hello and welcome to Cold War Week at the RAF Air Defence Radar Museum. I'm Matthew, the manager, and I'm joined today with John, who is one of the Cold War presenters. So welcome to John.
Good afternoon.
John, just for a start, so how, where and when did you serve?
Right, I joined up in January 1973, age 17. I did my 6 weeks training, basic training at Swinderby in Lincolnshire, and then went on to RAF Bordsea in Suffolk, the home of radar, to do my trade training. That lasted 6 weeks as well, and then I was posted to Buchan in Scotland on the east coast, just outside of Peterhead, and that was May 73. When I arrived there, there was pandemonium going on in the ops rooms because there were dozens of Soviet aircraft in our airspace. So normally we would get one or two just operating once or twice. However, we had best part of a dozen Soviet aircraft operating. We were not allowed to continue our training when we arrived there because it was completely operational. There was no day-to-day flying. There was no basic flying. We were kept out of the ops room, but we were allowed in just to see what was happening. And this is the first time, my first time of seeing what job we were about to do.
And was there any reason for that? Any reason why there were so many aircraft up?
Mayday.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I don't know what the significance was of 1973, but normally we would have one QRA jet taken off from Lucas intercepting what was going on. There were 6 QRA jets out of Lucas and 4 from the southern QRA operating in our airspace. And that went up as far as Iceland, so the Faroe Isles, the Danish radar site was controlling. Saxiford on the Shetland Isles was controlling. We had jets, and so did Bimbacula and the Hebrides. This was when it became real. We'd been practicing writing backwards. We'd been seeing what was going on, but this was the first time I generally thought, oh, this is what you're meant to be doing.
And then this, when you first started, when you went through all this training, was it an enjoyable experience? I mean,
Very.
It sounds quite scary that you were doing all these things, but was it something you felt some satisfaction from?
17, not knowing what I was coming into. You go on this course where it seems the impossible, like we're going to teach you how to write backwards. Okay, so you're working on perspex totes so that people can read the information. You're learning how to push like the World War II people did, plaques round a table. You're then learning about how radars work, and it was fascinating. And then you get sent up to Scotland, and this starts to happen, and you think, ooh, yeah, it was a very enjoyable time. And of course, I never saw that amount of aircraft in our airspace again. So, I have no idea what the significance of all these Soviet aircraft was.
Did you ever serve here at Neatishead yourself?
I did in the 90s. I came back from Berlin in 93 and was here. But I was detached into Neatishead in the late 70s to assist with an exercise that was going on. And I was then brought back up here from Cornwall to do some training. Because down in Cornwall we didn't get to see a lot of what was going on, and we didn't get many exercises. So to keep us current in what was going on, we came up here to supplement the force during an exercise.
So the exercises you were doing, obviously you've got quite a lot of TAC evaluation and things like that going on. Were they generally successful, or there was lots of things that were found from them?
The one I came down to the first time was a thing called a JMC, Joint Maritime Cooperation. And this was a totally staged exercise. You had a book and it would tell you what was going to happen at what time, with whom. So We worked with the Navy, and our aircraft were called serial. You would find out what the serial was, whether you were involved. So if Neatishead had a couple of aircraft that was going to go out, hand it over to the fleet and do exercises with them, but it was timed. So you knew on Tuesday at this time this was going to happen. We had a high frequency crosstail going on continually with the ships, so you'd have to sit there with an incredible noise coming on in your ears for about an hour while you were talking to the fleet. But you knew you were on for an hour and then off because of the amount of noise that was being generated.
So what, because you're doing all these exercises and things like that, is there any particular incident that you can think of that really epitomised what the Cold War was? It probably wasn't called the Cold War at the time, but what for you looking back, that would kind of epitomise everything that was going on at the time.
That first day, when all those Soviet aircraft, I didn't know it at the time that wasn't significant. Or sorry, it was significant. I thought that was going to be every day we were going to have this amount of Soviet aircraft in our airspace, and it never happened again. And it was only looking back I realised that was significant because it was so unusual.
And what kind of aircraft were you controlling at that time?
Then it was mainly Phantoms because the Lightning was just being phased out. So at Lucas we had one squadron of Lightnings and one squadron of Phantoms. So yeah, the Lightning was coming to the end of its time and the Phantom was going to take over.
Okay. Where did you live while you were serving?
In a little Nissen hut, 48C at Buchan. So the roof was made of asbestos.
Lovely.
Saw a picture the other day of the buildings in 1959, and they were still being used as accommodation in 1980. So you had 2 4-man rooms, the ablutions, toilets, bathroom, shower, a little room with a television so you could all meet together, and a corporal's bunk. And that was it. So basically 9 people sharing one billet. In Scotland, in the snow. Let's say I arrived there in May and it snowed in June. That was the most depressing thing. I got through everything and then snow? No.
But you enjoyed it. You did enjoy
Absolutely.
it. Yes.
I did 26 years, so it can't have affected me that much.
And then obviously you're exposed to quite a lot of information. You're aware of a lot of information with the overall air picture over the British Isles. So you're kind of a bit more aware than Joe Bloggs and the average civilian about what is going on, especially with a lot of that kind of Soviet tensions and things. Did you ever feel afraid that it was going to go from no, it's a Cold War into a hot war?
No. There was never that feeling. You have to remember, so these aircraft are flying around the top of Norway, flying down from 30 east all the way down into British airspace. They've been intercepted by the Norwegian Air Force. Our intelligence sources have got a rough idea where they're going, although back in the day we didn't know that this type of thing was happening, where we were getting our information from and the likes. And it was routine. So 2 jets, how far off the Norwegian coast normally indicated where they were going to appear on our plotting table. So 3 o'clock in the morning, honestly, we used to have a little kitty going. So everybody used to put some money in to buy the teas and coffees after the interception of where the aircraft were going to penetrate our radars. So once you won the money, you then had to buy everybody a cup of tea. So it wasn't a gain, but it gave you an idea, and that's how it was seen. So if it was further out off the coast, you knew they were probably going between Iceland, Faroes, a little bit closer between Faroes and the Shetlands, or occasionally they would come down into the North Sea. So, yes, there wasn't the tension.
Okay.
And of course, the only time is if aircraft were coming back from Africa. So the Soviets had a base in Senegal, I think it was, Conakry. So we wouldn't get the information they were coming back, and suddenly you would get these two aircraft appearing off the Outer Hebrides, heading northeast. So we would have to scramble our jets, intercept them, escort them through British airspace, and then when they disappeared off our radar, the jets would come back. Norwegians would then intercept them. If they were coming back from Cuba, the Americans would know that they'd got airborne, and so we would have a knowledge that they were going to appear in 6-8 hours, whatever time it took to get from Cuba to British airspace. So that was the only time that you wouldn't know that these aircraft were going to be there.
And they never, you never communicated with the Soviet aircraft.
No,
they never spoke to us.
No, the pilots would wave, and there's the stories of holding up Coke cans and certain material, papers and the likes, magazines from each aircraft. So it was basically a very, very... You didn't feel things were going to progress.
Okay. And then... logically, it's generally kind of expected that the end of the Cold War was when the Berlin Wall came down.
Yeah.
So obviously you were around at the time, and how did you feel when that came down?
I had just received my posting notice to go to Berlin. So November, I was told I was going to Berlin in May. So I arrived in Berlin. Everything was confused. So suddenly the Russians weren't these scary people that we'd been told. We got to meet them occasionally, and you could still hear live ammunition being used outside of Berlin. So everybody's heard of the Berlin Wall, but around where we were stationed at Gatow, it was right on the edge of West Berlin and on the edge of East Germany, West Berlin. So we didn't have a wall, it was a fence, because all the Soviet and Russian military, East German military, were on the other side of the fence. If the Third World War had kicked off, they would have just driven through the fence and captured the airfield. So they used to do these live firing exercises, and you could hear these heavy caliber guns going off the other side of the fence. And that was a bit... But again, we'd now realised that they were drawing down. So we knew there weren't that many Russians stationed there. And then eventually we could walk into what was no man's land. And it was spooky, eerie. So you had where all these fences used to be. They still had the control towers, watchtowers, but they were still stood there. But there was no fences, so you could walk where had been these zones where people would be shot for getting close to it, crossing over. And just up the road we had the Galinica Bridge of Spies, all this type of thing, where they did the exchange. So we weren't allowed to go there when it was still the Cold War, but after about a year we were allowed to cross over this bridge and have photographs taken, and we got to meet Russians. We had a station football competition where the Germans, the British, the French and the Russians were invited to play football. So it was a friendlier time. We just believed that nothing would happen in Europe again. There would be no more wars.
And I guess this is what we're bringing up to today with Ukraine and the current Russian activities in Ukraine. How does that make you feel when you obviously comparing it back to that time?
It seems completely different. It does feel now like it could go hot. When I spoke to the Russians that came to the football matches and things like this, we had an air tattoo, and the Russians were invited. We got to meet them. They really believed that hostilities would start when NATO attacked Russia. They were convinced they would never start it. And now you look at what's going on, and I feel that it's a different time. There is a tension that there wasn't. There was always the feeling that the leaders were speaking to each other and things wouldn't progress, where now I'm not too sure.
Worrying things. We'd like to end on a bit of a high, on a bit of a positive note. So, what was your proudest moment in your service?
Winning the Shetland Isles Rugby Sevens in 1990, just before I got posted to Berlin. We came from nowhere and just won this tournament, and it is still the proudest trophy I've got in the house, and it's the one I won't allow her to throw away.
John Baker, thank you very much for today.
You're welcome.
The Cold War Network Heritage Week was created by the Cold War Network, which is a collaborative community of historians, heritage professionals, educators and enthusiasts dedicated to exploring and preserving the history of the Cold War. To find out more, go to www.coldwarnetwork.co.uk.